Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ID Book Club, where we seek to dust off those old ID classics that have been sitting on your shelf, being meant to be read for quite some time, and hold each other accountable. And if you were not here with us last week, no worries, but we are picking up on chapter 2 of Kathy Moore's Map It. If we're not supposed to be teaching in these scenarios for training and design, then what are we supposed to do? In fact, that's exactly what chapter 2 is titled. If we don't teach, then what do we do? So hopefully we'll be able to discuss that a little bit this morning. As always, from last time as well, we'll do a quick little recap and then jump into discussion tables based on a few thought questions we had in mind, and then have a few of you up on the stage to share your insights, because that's what this is all about as we're reading through it together as a community. So Kathy starts off this chapter 2 with a quote, giving us the answer to that question of if we're not supposed to teach, then what do we do? We need to come down from the clouds and ask potentially scary questions, meaning come down from that perspective of all we have is information that we're going to dump upon our learning audience and hope that they do well with that. No. We got to come down from the clouds, be more realistic. And those potentially scary questions she brings up are questions like, what are we really trying to do? What shows us that there is a performance problem? Or better yet, the scariest question of all, is training even necessary? Is training even a good response for this situation? Is it the solution? And so, as we're coming down from the clouds, trying to get more realistic, I love this chapter. And if you read along with us, I'm not going to go through the full scenario, but Kathy just models for us exactly what we should be doing in our training design rather than just telling us step by step, giving us the information. She actually guides us through two versions of the same story. So, the story driven approach, if you didn't get to read the chapter, go for it. I'm not going to address all of the different aspects and scenarios, but I would like to see us maybe touch on a few of those elements there, because really it's so helpful and insightful to see that kind of scenario based approach to, well, how do we come down from the clouds and not just give information dumps? But she gives us two scenarios. And I bet you already figured out from your reading or just from this description which of the two is preferred. And so we have the option, we definitely have the option to look at that school model like we touched on last week. And under that school model, we believe our job is to create a course. And as we mentioned, some of us, especially if you're former teachers like I am, or those involved in education previously, we might get a little defensive. We might say, hey, wait a second. I wasn't just trying to transfer knowledge. I did do my best to create activities that enhance performance and behavior. But just because we're talking about the school model doesn't mean that all teachers subscribe to this a school model. But the vast majority do, and the vast majority of any clients or potential learners have been trained by this school model, which is, here is the information, here's what you need to know, that's it. And so under the school model, Kathy goes ahead and lines out what a scenario might be where someone is asked for to design a training and what that might look like. And so if you didn't pick up on her very clever names, Tina Teach a Lot is the one who will be following, who is going to design a course. And in fact, as she is designing that course, there's a few steps in this scenario that Kathy picks up on. And this version of the story should sound pretty familiar. And it is all about this course creation approach. It's one that we might have seen before. It might be kind of comfortable for us. But effective change does not come through comfortability. Sometimes we have to get a little uncomfortable in order to get to the point where we need to be able to move beyond that. So with that course creation approach, Kathy approaches it this way. One, it's not very time effective, is it? And I don't know if you picked up on this or not as she's going through, taking a look at, the scenario there, moving on from page 19 to 20. The first problem that Tina Teachalot has is she says one single word. She's approached by a higher up to create a course, and her answer is the problem. And that answer is one single word, and that word is sure, I'll do it. Sounds good. I'll create a course. No problem. Here's a bunch of slides. I'm going to go through and create a course. And that's the problem. She said, sure. And Kathy's going to give us some solutions to avoid that response. But as we look on through, we notice that this really is not a time effective method of going about in, well, trying to train others. I think in the scenario, she returns with a 130 slide option, a script to a higher up, and has to wait like a long time to get feedback. And that's an issue. She stalled. She can't go on further in that development process if you're waiting for that individual, that higher up, to respond back with feedback. But it's also not cost effective. If you notice in the scenario, there's opportunities where Tina could have spent money on making relevant or adding relevant aspects to the training, like custom pictures or anything like that that would be like more helpful to connect the audience. But because she spent so much money in this development on uh, recording narration, which is really just recording a bunch of reading information. Well, it's not cost effective either with this course creation approach. But Kathy also brings up something too. Well, how is this formulated? How is this put together? It's very repetitive. We have information, presentation, knowledge check, presentation, knowledge check, presentation, knowledge check, over and over again. Again, very much focused on that knowledge transfer idea. You might see some problems with that. You can probably already be thinking back, flashbacks to some of your own negative experiences with this info dump type of learning where it's just repetitive and not helpful, and you're not changing your behavior at all. But most importantly, I found this one was pretty helpful. It leads to false measures of success. Because if we're not really looking for behavioral change and just knowledge transfer, well, what measures that? In fact, I think Kathy goes on to say something about like, hey, most people report that they learned a little bit or they learned a lot. And that really sounds like a actionable metric to work with, right? No, of course not. In fact, Kathy goes on to say there on page 21 that no one even knows if people have changed their behavior on the job because no one's measuring that, right? There's no behavior change that's being addressed. There's no behavior change that's being measured. And that's not going to produce a change in action. And that's not probably going to produce anything that is helpful for the business in achieving those objectives that they really seek to change and deliver on. So, with that in mind, that's one option. I'm hoping that we see quite obviously that, you know, that's not the way to go. That's not what action mapping is going to be about. In fact, if you look at the next scenario that Kathy highlights, just an amount of pages I thought was interesting. I think there's like 3 pages spent on this first course creation driven scenario, but there's like 13, 13 allocated just for this more action oriented approach, the action mapping approach. And as Kathy says there, with action mapping, the second approach, the job is to solve the problem. And that sounds great, but it's going to be detailed. And of course, the rest of the book will highlight all of that as we go on through. But let's take a look at what exactly this looks like. What is the focus on behavior changes in solving the problem within a business going to look like? Again, with the scenario, I'm not going to read through and touch on all the different specifics with our other individual there. It's not just Tina Teach a Lot, it's also Anna Action Von Map, as Kathy cleverly sets these individuals up. But this is the problem solving approach, one that we're going to focus on for the rest of our reading. In that problem solving approach, though, if you looked at that list of questions that Kathy gives us on page 22, oh, it's so helpful, right? We're asked to question the intent of a proposed training. We're asked to question the significance of that proposed training. Questions, questions, questions. There can't be enough questions there. And that really is what drives this beginning stage of the approach. And within that as well, one of those questions I thought was so helpful is Anna asked the higher up there, uh, do you have a target metric in mind? Notice the difference between that and what the previous scenario that was more course creation driven, what the response was or what the questions were. Well, one, there weren't really any questions. The answer was, sure, I'll do it. I'll make a course. Whereas this asked, do you have a target metric in mind? Do we have something to work with? What are we looking for in terms of behavioral change? And that's huge, right? That's huge. Beyond that, though, Kathy suggests with this problem solving approach, we start trying to identify what people do, And that means looking to see what's currently being used to solve the problem. Again, when I say solve the problem, it's obviously not working. And so, what's currently being thrown out there as a possible solution? It could be current job aids. It could be procedures that no one really wants to read. How do we take that and turn it into something that changes behavior and people want to actually engage in? Identifying what people do is going to be helpful in that regard. But it's not just that, it's also identifying why aren't they doing it? Why aren't those job aids being used and utilized as something with the images as the scenario goes? Is it because the procedures, again, they're hidden or no one's using them, they're not engaging? There's lots of things there, but one thing I thought was so helpful and important in that one section alone is how Kathy focuses in on the role of SMEs, on subject matter experts, and on like higher up management. Because in this part of identifying why aren't people using what's already out there as a solution for them, is it brings the subject matter experts and the managers together. It bridges that gap of awareness or lack of awareness. And that itself could be part of that problem solving approach. In fact, I think if she goes on to say something about that manager is surprised to hear that people aren't actually using what it is that they've proposed to use. And his job doesn't bring him into contact with those who are using these proposed training solutions. Bridging that gap as a performance consultant here is huge and can really make a minor change to make a major difference. And so that's a problem solving approach. And you're saying, oh, okay, that sounds great. That's where we should be going. Of course, that's the case. But how do we get there? How do we get there? We got to find the best solution. And as proposed in the chapter and what we'll see going on forward, training is not always a solution. A course is not always a solution. It could be a job aid, but we're using e-learning here as the proposed solution because that's often the case, right? That doesn't mean it's always the case. But if we're going to find the best solution, she gives us several steps to follow. Steps for success, right? Start by brainstorming activities. Notice, brainstorm activities, not brainstorm information, not brainstorm how we can dump that information upon the learners. Activities themselves, things that are engaging, things that are going to involve those learners. She also focuses on prototyping and mock-ups for immediate feedback. Now, the previous scenario had our individual there who wrote a really, really long script and had to wait a long time for feedback. But here, using this action mapping process, our trainer and designer was able to get immediate feedback over and over and over again, prototyping a solution from a perspective that helps both the client themselves and prototyping and mocking up a version that would help the learners. So there's multiple stages to that. There's multiple opportunities for that immediate feedback. There's engagement. There's a relationship there between the one who is asking for this training and the one who's designing it, not a pause, wait for weeks or maybe months before any feedback's given. Creating an outline, not a script. Now, you might be thinking like, well, we need a script if we're going to use more scenario-driven learning solutions here. And that's true if you're talking about dialogue, but thinking about an outline to get feedback on rather than a fully drawn out script of here's what all the narration is going to tell us. No, how about an outline that writes it out as this is what we're going to show the learners, showing, not just telling. And then we talked about this last time, and some of you brought this point up that loving this idea of space practice, because we can implement this training, but with space practice in mind, meaning it's going to occur multiple times in multiple stages or versions there, and with ongoing evaluation in mind. It's not just once and you're done. How do we actually track and measure that change in performance and behavior? And those steps are detailed. And you might be thinking, wait a second, you said the course creation option was more time consuming. Well, it's maybe more time dependent, but if we're really going to find the best solution, it will take time. It will take effort. It takes a lot of questions and following through with this process that Kathy has given us there. So with all that in mind, I do hope that you found the scenarios there helpful, the questions helpful. But what do we do with this? How do we implement this in our own practice? Here's where you get to help me out and engage with others. We're going to be hopping into those discussion tables here in just a little bit. And I got 3 questions for you. Each of those 3 questions correlate with one of those 3 tables that are going to show up after we pause the session right now on the stage. But those questions hopefully will inspire you to discuss further with others dealing with the same issues as you might find yourself in, or just even imagining what this could look like. So here's what I'm thinking when it comes to questions there. Number 1, is ADDIE compatible with the action mapping process? And before we get too far, yes, it'd be helpful to go over what ADDIE is, right? So as we're talking about ADDIE, and Kathy does outline that and suggest that it is being used in both these scenarios, maybe in just different ways. But we're talking about ADDIE, we're talking about analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. With that in mind, in that process, is ADDIE compatible with the action mapping process and framework? That's one question I might want you to think about. Think about examples you can come up with there as you jump into those discussion groups. But beyond that, what about feedback and iteration? How do feedback and iteration affect process? We saw that as being one of the key differences between these 2 scenarios. Have you seen that in your own practice as well? Or could you imagine a scenario where feedback and iteration would be helpful or just affect the process overall? Help us out with that question. And then lastly, does how we view our job description really make a difference, right? Does that matter? Does frame of mind and mindset when it comes to knowing what our job is as designers or training developers, or does that matter to the overall, outcome or even process that we might approach here? There's 3 questions I'd love to hear from your perspective after we get to address those in these discussion groups. Is ADDIE compatible with the action mapping process? What did that group discuss and come up with? Again, hopefully these questions were pretty obviously leading to the point that yes, they can be, but in what ways? What ways can ADDIE be compatible with this action mapping process? We're gonna have Thomas come up and help us out there. So
Sorry about that. Hey, how you doing, Nathan?
hey, good to see you.
Good, good. I'm gonna try to remember like verbatim what I went over. So for me, I guess with my own bias, I feel like Tina is kind of the ADDIE side of things. and Anna
Yes.
is more agile. Um,
Mhm.
so it makes me think of people like Michael Allen from Allen Interactive. Um, they have a process that's very iterative. So you can go back and work on your prototype. It affords you that sort of process. Agile, Addy, I'm sorry, is like the waterfall. And
Mhm.
historically, the waterfall process, you go down to the next step. There's no jumping back, right? So it's kind of limited. But I don't think that's the death knell for Addy. I think Addy, someone else in the group brought it up that if you are sort of limited, like if you're sort of independent, like that, there might be some limitations that would afford you to use Addy.
Mhm.
Addy might be the best case for certain scenarios, but and also someone else made a good point. Like, why is Addy so popular in the corporate world? Uh,
Mhm.
I I guess it is. I'm not so sure, but I think instructional design as an umbrella phrase is a relatively new thing. So maybe there's a feeling out process. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate the insight too. And based on the conversation with your group, if we looked at what Kathy Moore said, she's not saying don't use Addy, but I think it comes down to your organization's view or your instructional design team's view of Addy. She suggests that use each of those parts of Addy, but maybe start with evaluating first and then analyzing and then designing at a high level and then developing in branches. She gives us those very specific ways to incorporate it that might fit more with that iterative agile design that you were referring to, Thomas. But you know, that's interesting. I'm saying in the chat too, people are saying they have to get every single word, step of Addy approved before moving on to the next step. But like as we saw with the previous scenario, that makes things really difficult and time consuming. You're not going to be able to get out those iterations and those prototypes and being able to make a training, if that's necessary, that actually helps drive and change behavior in an organization. So yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Thomas, for sharing that with us, and thanks to everyone in those groups who brought that
Thank
forward
you.
there. So, all right. Any other perspectives on that? I mean, I think we're of the mindset of maybe we shift our focus on how Addy is being addressed in these scenarios, but um, if not, let's move on to that next one. In fact, this kind of is the next step there, talking about iteration, talking about, well, the need for feedback and to really check everything off down the list for Addy might make things difficult if that's the approach we have. So maybe, you have some comments here from the table that met, or even if you didn't meet the table, still love to hear what you have to say about how do feedback and iteration affect the process. I didn't say positively or negatively, although hopefully you have some insights for us there. But how do feedback and iteration help the process, especially if we're focusing on the action mapping process? Raise your hand there if you'd like to hop up on stage and share with us some of those thoughts that your group came up with.
There we go. Uh,
Hello there.
so one of the things that I said in the chat was I came from a product management background, and then I moved into training. And I brought all of that agile process and customer discovery process with me, and that's how we approach training. I think one of the advantages that I had was that I was focused on software product training. So it's much easier to put out little bits and pieces and get feedback from customers, learners in this case, about that process. But in terms of management, because they were accustomed to a product management structure, um, it was much easier to implement those iterative and feedback loop processes. I think if you work for a company that has a software department, there's probably opportunity to interact with them and make that argument up to management because it's a model that they already see.
True.
So rather than just saying, I don't want to do Addy anymore, it's I'm looking at the product team and the excellence that they have. Let's look at that, and that might be an in some cases to get out of that heavy waterfall thing. Instant feedback is great. putting a
Yes.
course out there or putting a learning experience out there and immediately getting customers back saying that works or that doesn't work.
Mhm.
I can change it on a dime.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so neat to see, like, yeah, how your background helped influence that. But then that also goes back to every organization is going to be different. Every team is going to be different. But if we rewind back to chapter one, the core aspect that Kathy started with was it's all about culture. And it sounds like, you had opportunity to either have a culture that was already ready for that next step of pushing forward with a more like iterative, feedback driven process, but that's not everywhere. And so maybe that's where we start too, right? Is adjusting the culture and doing our part if we can, where we can. That'll lead to our roles question next, how we view our job description, but where we can to make those changes. um, yeah yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Laurel. Appreciate that perspective. And good for you being able to affect that change on your team too. Any others that want to speak to that question of um, what role or how important feedback and iteration may be? Of course, Kathy Moore suggests that needs to be there, and frequent, right? Frequent feedback, immediate feedback. That's going to make the difference, and that's focused on in action. It's not just looking at a script of slides and waiting for feedback on that from either SME or anyone else who's higher up. That iterative approach definitely makes the difference, right? Might take longer in the long scheme, but it's going to be more effective overall. Fantastic. Well, let's look at that last question. We had quite a few at this table. I got to spend a little bit more time here, and we had some fantastic ideas. So share those with us. Does how we view our job description really make a difference? And I heard some people talking about what their like elevator pitch for what their role even is. Can we describe that to others? How would you describe your role as an instructional designer when you're talking with those and mingling at a party? I thought that was a helpful way to approach this, but does how we view our job description really make a difference? Anyone want to share with us their insights?
So this one kind of hits home with me. My official title, at least, under my contract, is technical writer / instructional designer. And
Mhm.
when I heard that phrase for the first time, I shook a little bit because my instructional design professor, he convinced me to skip the technical writing class. Don't do it. It's a waste of time, right? So that was how I sort of fell into my name. But as the time went by, I tell people I'm an instructional designer because that's the coined term. People understand that whatever's digestible, whatever's I can communicate. And once we get past that door, let's talk about what other things I might be, what I think I might be. Am I more a developer? Am I more a consultant? Right. So for me, I just kept it simple. The technical writing part the name doesn't come up. I guess I do some technical writing. Sure, it comes with the territory, but just instructional designer, kept it
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah. And I think it's helpful, like what's the correlation between the name or the title you're given and the way you think about it, right? And then that really, Kathy doesn't even touch on like names or descriptions as much as the mindset, right, behind it, because you're going to be doing some technical writing in your role in your job, but maybe that's not what you go by. That's an interesting perspective, right? Thanks for sharing that, Thomas. Why don't I have Linda head on up here? I'd love to hear your perspective as well on, does it matter how we view these roles, how we view our job description?
So I was sharing that in a party situation or
Yes.
in any kind of situation, right? I'm in an airplane, whatever it is, and somebody asks me, "What do you do for work?" And instead of saying I am an instructional designer, because most people look at you with a blank face, um,
Mhm.
I will, and then also listing off, well, I create e-learning and training materials and facilitator guide. I just have changed that perspective, and say my elevator pitches. I help at the time. It's more like I help whatever the role is. So I help travel consultants do their jobs better. And so when I say that, then people are actually interested in what I have to say next, as opposed
Yes.
to when I say I'm an instructional designer. And I think the difference in those two approaches is that if I were to just say I am an instructional designer and I create all these things, it really sounds like I'm an order taker. And
Yeah.
that's not how I want to come across to anybody. That
Mhm.
that's I am just producing stuff and that's all I do.
Mhm.
Whereas the other way, the elevator pitch that I do use allows me to talk about how I work with stakeholders to try and identify the business problem. They come to me for that. I identify gaps in performance, and
Mhm.
anyway, so that results in a more interesting conversation. I think that they perceive me a little differently when they hear me present myself that way.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that's very real too, right? And even if it's just like, oh, the things that we're saying, are people going to be interested after we give them a description? That's probably not a bad rule of thumb to go by. But as you focus on, you use that phrase "order taker" too, which Kathy kind of touches on. Like, let's take us from listing off all the things we're told to do, and shift to, as you said, to summarize what you said, what changes do you help affect in your organization, right? Like how do you help change what's going on, not just what you do and the checklists of things that you might be able to accomplish each day or over a period of time, but like, how do you affect change and help and see that change in action in your organization? Well, thanks so much for sharing your perspective there. Really helpful, insightful, and everyone, thank you for your perspectives, because you know as simple as some of these descriptions go, or these perspectives go, like they seem pretty similar, pretty familiar to us. But as we're getting in and diving deeper into action mapping, we're going to notice a few things. Let's talk about where we move next. Chapter 2 was about figuring out, what do we do if we're not going to teach. Next steps you're going to see is, okay, let's look at chapter 3 and 4. That's your assignment, as we're holding each other accountable. We'll meet again next Friday, same time, same place. But chapter 3 and 4 are going to really help us, how to figure out how we start these conversations. How do we lead that kickoff meeting? How do we set the tone, so we're not just saying, as Tina Teach-A-Lot said, sure, I'll make that course. Uh, how do we actually initialize that conversation? So chapter 3 and 4 next week. Check Slack for updates there with the book club channel, and join us if you would like to get a little bit of your reading done together for our ID community reading hour. We're holding those every Thursday at 5, a little bit more casual of a conversation there, but hopefully another way to help network with others and talk with others about the text, if you didn't already get to do that this morning. But let's leave us with this one final thought. Kathy says there on page 35, from your first contact with your client, act as if your job is to help them solve their problem. Can we use that to maybe redefine our job description, how we would talk to others about what we do? Not just take orders and say, sure, I'll make a course, but how can we affect change in an organization and see that performance problem solved through behavioral focus and changes there with others? So I will see you next Friday. Thank you so much for being here and your participation. I couldn't do this without you and the community. So please keep on showing up and helping us out. We all appreciate it. And I will see you next Friday, next week, same time, same place. I will be in a table to discuss things further. If you'd like to give feedback or figure out where we want to move in the next direction there, or still have questions and follow up there, happy to do so. I'll be in those tables in a second. Otherwise, I will see everybody next week. Thank you. Thank you.